Hello everyone, here's my sermon from Sunday, based on 1 Corinthians 9, verses 13 to 27. Are we all things to all people? Do we even want to be? I'm guessing that the answer is probably no. Because it seems an impossible shout. It's a tall order. When we hear that phrase, all things to all people, it's usually prefaced by the you can't be. You can't be all things to all people. You can't please everyone. Not everyone is going to like you. Don't even try. It's a lost cause. And yet here we have Paul saying that he did in fact become all things to all people in order to proclaim the gospel. And I don't know about you, but it makes me feel completely inadequate. Paul may have had the dedication and the drive, but just thinking about being all things to all people makes me want to go and get my duvet and pull the covers up over my head. But is that really what Paul's saying? Well, in order to answer that, we need to go back to the start of this morning's passage, where Paul is talking about how he earns his living. As we know from Paul's life and ministry, he travelled constantly, and to do that, he would have needed money. So this morning's passage opens by him explaining that people usually get paid from wherever they serve. If you work in the temple, you get paid by the temple. So Paul reasons that if you preach the gospel for your life's work, you should be entitled and able to have that work also provide your living, which is very good news for those of us who receive a stipend. Paul, however, doesn't do that, as he tells us here. He earns his own living and he's not trying to claim back what he's entitled to, which is maybe not such good news for those of us who receive a stipend after all. And Paul's reasoning is that he does this because he wants to present the gospel free of charge, and that's the only reward he seeks. And of course, increasingly in the Church of England, there are priests who have chosen this path, becoming self-supporting ministers, where they work for some of the week and then do their ministry for the rest of it. As a slight digression, this never felt like the right course of action to me. As someone who has to be all in on anything I'm doing, I couldn't see how I could give 100% to my job and 100% to being a priest. But God calls each of us to serve in the way that is right for us because of the intimate knowledge he has of what makes us tick. So I don't lose any sleep over taking a different role to some of my colleagues. And then Paul gets to this all things to all people part. Paul means he is free because of his new life in Jesus. He's been set free from the idea that he must work and work to earn God's love and grace. Because as Paul knew and as we know, that is something we can never earn because it is given as a gift. His life in Jesus is what enables Paul to receive this gift, and so he is free. And yet, in order to help others find this same freedom, Paul is willing to change the patterns of his life. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, so that I might win the weak. It would be easy to conclude from hearing this that Paul is somehow compromising his beliefs or his identity in order to get himself in with these groups of people, dumbing down the gospel, if you will. But I don't think that's what Paul is saying here. I think what he's saying is that he didn't insist or assume that others would adopt his ways and practices as their own in order to become followers of Jesus. Instead of insisting that Jews give up their practices or that Gentiles had to become Jews, Paul took a different route. He simply walked alongside those who he wanted to encourage to come and know Jesus. He spent years living with different communities, building relationships, learning about them, sharing with them. And Paul did it because he was in it to win it. He had one purpose and one purpose only, to share the good news with others. And when others accepted the good news and found new life in Christ, for Paul, that was a great reward to receive. And of course, while he was doing this, Paul was doing nothing more than following the example of Jesus. Jesus didn't wait for people to come to him or for them to become like him. even if they could have tried to do that. Instead, he travelled to where the people were. He ate with them, stayed in their homes, and spent time with them, even while he was being criticised by the religious leaders of the day for doing so. Unfortunately, our history in the church of sharing Jesus with people around the world doesn't hold up well when compared to this model. For many centuries, when missionaries travelled abroad, they also took with them a demand that becoming a Jesus follower also meant becoming a Westerner. So when missionaries shared the story of Jesus with the Native Americans had to abandon their own culture and traditions in order to become Christian. This is the very opposite of what Paul is describing here this morning, of being all things to all people. And as a result, there is still a great deal of pain and damage and healing that needs to take place because of the way that Jesus' message and Jesus' way was mixed up with what people thought was right at the time. I spent most of Saturday facilitating a PCC away day for another benefice in the diocese. They're very different to us, 12 parishes, mostly small Norfolk villages. Like us, however, they are faced with maintaining ancient buildings, have in some places dwindling congregations, and of course the perennial struggle of meeting parish share. 3 years ago, they had an away day where they reviewed what was going on in their parishes through the old diocesan vision strategy: listen, celebrate, imagine, empower. And there was a great deal to celebrate. Lots of different activities aimed at reaching out, at placing the church in the heart of the community. But what they also had was an awareness that there were groups that they didn't have a connection with. Young people, the 50 to 60-year-olds, those who'd moved into the area. But what was really striking about this benefice was that they had a great desire to find ways to do so. They had indeed embraced the notion of being all things to all people. And then COVID struck. And so they weren't able to enact any of the plans that they had, at least not initially. But through the pandemic, they stepped outside their comfort zones and tried to find different ways of connecting with the community, like us going online. And so we reviewed what they did, and we thought about what they were going to do. And we celebrated the things that they were doing once again: their art cafe, the 2 vicars becoming chaplains to the local high school. So how can we embody the example of Paul, the example of Jesus, the example of this benefice as we share the good news? I think we must begin by being clear about our purpose. Paul writes about being clear about his purpose. He's a runner in a race intent on winning the prize, not one who runs aimlessly. For Paul, the prize is when others learn about Jesus and commit their lives to following him, to being disciples. The prize is when others experience new life as he has, not his new life, but their new life in Jesus. His eyes are fixed on the purpose. So what's our purpose? Many times we talk about wanting to have more people in church, more children, more young people, more families, more people in the chairs. I hope for that too. But are we clear about why we want that? Do we want more people simply so we can survive, so we can continue to exist as an organisation, so we have more people to help us meet the parish share or go on the coffee rater? Or, and I really hope this is the answer, has Jesus so changed our lives? Have we been so transformed by the love of God that what we want is for other people to experience that too, and to journey with us as we seek to live more fully into the plan that God has for our lives? If that's what we want, if that's our purpose, then maybe having our eye on the prize can shape how we shape our message. I worry that all too often, when churches invite others to follow Jesus, what they're really doing is inviting people to become like them. They'd like it if people came to church just as they did, if they had the same values just as they do, if they behaved just like they do, if they get involved in church activities just like they do and practice their faith exactly as they do. And that seems easy, doesn't it? But the problem is, if that's what we do, aren't we in fact doing exactly the same thing as the missionaries in North America did to the Native Americans? What if, instead of inviting people to come and be like us, we instead invite ourselves to go and be like them? Church can happen anywhere, but it happens especially if we are willing to step into the lives of others, to cross boundaries, to make connections, just as Paul did, just as Jesus did, so that when we offer our lives, our time, our love to others, we might be able to share what God has done for us and what God can do for them. Paul's goal was simple: to reach others. But the church is the only organisation that does not exist for its members. Let me say that again. The church is the only organisation that does not exist for its members. It's not about us, the ones who are